Buckle up as we gaze into the creative operations crystal ball. That's right, we're going on a journey on today's episode. We're going to start to explore what and where the future of creative operations might be headed. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jeremy Wintroub, EVP of Creative Operations and Production at ICP, a leading content operations firm. Jeremy brings a unique perspective from his background on the brand side at companies like NBC Universal before taking on his current role helping shape creative operations strategies and implementation for ICP's clients. In our wide-ranging discussion, Jeremy and I analyze emerging trends and opportunities on the horizon for creative ops professionals like you. How will rapidly advancing technologies like AI impact the field? We dive into the evolving relationship between scale and storytelling as organizations face increasing demands for more content delivered at a faster pace, and at the same time, the need for great storytelling to break through the noise of the content tsunami that audiences are increasingly ignoring. How can AI help solve some of these challenges while elevating rather than replacing human creativity? Jeremy shares his vision for breaking down silos between creative and marketing through new cross-functional team models. He emphasizes the importance of deep empathy and communications between these groups to drive impactful creative work to business results. We also explore how roles may blend and organizational structures could be reshaped by AI's advanced capabilities. So get ready to gaze into the crystal ball of creative operations future on this thought-provoking episode. Whether you lead a creative ops team or a creative professional, marketer, or executive, you're sure to gain valuable insights to start thinking about and preparing for what might be next. Jeremy, welcome to the Creative Ops Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. We're going to start like we start every episode. What is your definition of creative operations?
Thanks, first of all, for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. A big fan of the podcast and all that you're doing to help grow our field and creative operations. To me, creative operations is a set of workflows, people, process, and technology that help us get the stories out that we need to get told, specifically where I sit around marketing and sales workflows. And creative operations is a mix of people, process, and technology that help bring story to life and help breathe oxygen into what has been a very fractured process for many decades and to bring modernity to that corner. It's an exciting time for creative operations as we define what it is.
Awesome. So there's a few words that really stuck out for me in your definition: stories, oxygen, and fractured. So I want to pick those up in a second. But just as way of background for the audience, you're the EVP of Creative Operations and Production at ICP. You've got a background on the brand side. You're most recently with NBC Universal. And you and I met each other just a short while ago, and we've enjoyed nerding out together. And the reason I was excited to do this with you is in your role at ICP, which is a firm that I believe really refers to itself as content operations specialists. It's a firm that's been around for a long time. It's got a really good reputation and background in history. And you came into the organization as creative operations has become a greater need for its client base, helping them figure out how do we need to update our processes? What is the technology that we need to put in place to enable
Right.
those processes? And what's the right mix of skills we're going to need today with a view to tomorrow for people, process, technology, and all the skill sets that are going to be required. So you got this pretty unique perch to look at the landscape and just see what's going on in different types of organizations across different industries and things like that. And maybe we can go back to your definition again and stories,
Sure.
oxygen, fractured. Let's start with fractured. Why do you think the creative process has been fractured, and why do we need to fix it?
I think the stew of why it's fractured is multidimensional, but I'll start with a couple of critical points. First of all, when you're developing creative, you're almost always starting from a new concept, right? You're inventing something based on a brief. You're trying to do a job. So you're trying to build a new creative look. You're trying to build a new brand. You're trying to build a new campaign. You're trying to build a new template for something. And you're starting from sometimes from nothing, from a brief that doesn't come from a person who has a creative background, but you're asking that to be done by a person who's specialized in creative storytelling, right? And there's this interpretation layer that has to happen. And the organizations that I've been in, different parts of organizations, that interpretation layer. So, what I want versus what I get is the first point of fracture, right? So, how do I know that I'm going to get back what I want, right? And then you've got an immense amount of talent bound up in our creative talent inside of organizations. But creative is not always a linear process, right? Expressing themselves and finding the right solutions. It doesn't always follow a very time bound and linear process. But that doesn't mean that we can't bring operational focus to it, that we can't create the conditions for creative to be successful. But we haven't put those conditions in place. What has been done, and I'm speaking a little bit generally here, Nish, is we've said it's the creative. So we just don't bother them. Just give them the brief and they'll come back when it's done. Or we'll hire a different agency to do the work, or we'll change the talent there. Right. And so we haven't really established the conditions of success. And at the same time, we've turned up the output that we require from a creative perspective. So we've said we need story. We need it to be better. We need it to be sharper and more channel focused. Oh, and by the way, we need 20 times the amount of it. But we still need you to be your creative best self. And so our field has come into focus to say, how can we help? How can we aid this process? How can we make it smoother for people? How can we take data in the briefing process? How can we make it more transparent for folks? How can we make it less fractured? There's this classical tension between marketing and creative departments. Why? It's simply about communication. And I think for us in creative operations, those of us who find the joy of unlocking a brief and helping a creative express their vision for something that is on brief, like creatives go way off brief sometimes, and it's not the appropriate way to answer a brief, right? The creatives aren't always right. But unlocking that ability to tell the right story at the right time for the right action on behalf of a brand or a product or a customer, that's magic to a creative operations person. And so trying to find ways through relationship, people, process, like doing the right things at the right time with the right communication vehicles, and technology, frankly, putting this into more pleasant user experiences are really foundational, I think, to where companies of scale need to go in order to meet the moment on the other side, which is we're all seeing messages every day, hundreds, thousands of times a day. And how do we stand out in those marketplaces?
You mentioned communication a few times as it pertains to the creative brief. And just to tee this up, I think one of the issues in the creative operations space is that historically it's still rooted in a project management mindset where as long as we've got the right process in place, i.e., the process that makes sense on the whiteboard when we all get in the room and draw it out and go, here's the ideal way of working. But
Does that ever work, by the way? Does that ever?
no, it doesn't.
Okay.
Creative operations grew up as, oh, we have a project management problem. So the solution is project management. And you talk about communications in the creative brief and this
Mm.
in a, it's almost like marketers are from Mars and creators are from Venus type of problem. And Kate Sullivan in the first episode talked about this as well. And she put a lot of focus on communications. But communications seems like one of those highly subjective, messy things, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
humans are messy. How do you actually think about addressing the communications gap in the creative brief? Because that's where it starts, and all the problems or lack of problems downstream start at the creative brief. So, how do we get better at communicating through this vehicle called a creative brief that everyone uses? But I think the vast majority aren't their creative brief process isn't as strong as it could be as a way of enabling communication between the marketers and the creatives.
I think there's a few fundamental components that are necessary in starting a project. One is look me in the eyes. Does this make sense? And that can be virtual or it can be in person. I tend to believe maybe it's the number of years I have on a calendar, but I tend to still find that sitting in a room or walking in a hallway past someone is a lot better way to make sure that to attain alignment than a screen modality, although it's possible. It's certainly possible to do it in a virtual context. And the written word can be misconstrued. So the how many times have you gotten an email from someone? This is not related to a creative niche, brief niche, but you've gotten an email from someone and you've misinterpreted their context about something, right? So I think one of the things about a creative brief for a really important strategic project is it should be read out. It should be understood by the creative team and read out, not just sent over as if it's some sort of a form to be filled out. It's a ceremony and it's treated as such in some organizations. It's a milestone, a ceremony, a part of the kickoff. The other is that a creative brief should not be necessarily a subjective one. You talked in your dots episode and you talked in your data episode about what are the insights behind a brief. So insights don't only have to come from a post analysis perspective. They should be turned over as part of a brief. And we shouldn't protect creative operations and creative folks from data. And I think you and I are aligned on this just from listening to several episodes of your pod, that having some data in there that makes certain reasons to believe or reasons why these elements or of a brief are important are really important to support a creative brief argument. So the quality and the amount of time spent on writing the brief is really important. Having the brief delivered in a human way is important, even if it's written in an MRM tool or it's delivered in Monday.com or some other tool. It doesn't mean that there isn't a human that spent time to think about, hey, here's my need and here's what I'm hoping to do with it. The other thing that I see a lot is briefs will come over half baked. So you'll get a brief for something, but you'll get a brief for something, but it might be missing the audiences. And we if you liken that to other business processes, you wouldn't take valuable resources and have them get started with half the story. And so I do think kind of protecting and caring for the time of the resources that we have is really important. It's adding a bit of discipline, which is a classic project management function, to say, is your brief ready to go? And if it's not, then saying, let's hold a minute, let's hold a day, let's hold a week, because we're going to spend just as much time trying to figure out what you want in that brief as if you were just to take the extra week, marketeer or media person or brand person, to say, hey, let me get really clear on what I'm trying to express here. And that's going to promote a better partnership and less of a Venus and Mars dynamic as you expressed it. I think there are some critical components, things that have been really successful for me when I sat on the creative operations side at a brand. And as we think about and express to our clients how to make that process clearer, I do think it comes down to behavior and communication. It can be enabled by technology. Technology alone will not solve a failure of briefing inside an organization. You can add rigor and clarity, but there needs to be humanity in briefing.
I love the fact that you use the word human and humanity 2 to 3 times in your answer, because I think the classic mistake that a lot of organizations make, and this isn't a creative operations issue, but in any function, is let me go and find the piece of technology that's going to solve our problems. And as somebody who has built and run software companies, technology is not the place to start. The place to start is like looking in the mirror and looking at each other and going, why is this not working the way it should be? And it's often rooted in those very human things like communication and creative. You called it like the big strategic creative. That is a human enterprise. That is where it starts and that is where it ends. And along the way, technology is going to help you tell amazing stories, but it is very much a human enterprise. And we still hear the same refrain. People aren't filling out the forms. They're not giving us enough information. It's the same thing today as it was like 8, 10 years ago. And I think the answer is as simple but as complex as that communications and that humanity. I love the idea of a ceremony, as you called it. I definitely want to talk about as scale versus story. What's the creative that you just need quick? We've done it before. It's more like copy paste work.
Yep.
Probably don't need a ceremony for that. But for that blank sheet creative, treating it like a ceremony, I think is critical. And what you're saying about data, that being part of the process. So you've got this bifurcation of is this need from marketing about something we've done before? So it's in the scale category versus storytelling category, which is
Mhm.
quote unquote new creative. And then should we be thinking about the creative brief gets split into two parts? Part one is give me your initial information, marketer, and then pulling in maybe some data that would be beneficial to the marketer and the creative. And then that ceremony is about them getting together to talk through these things. Okay, what are you really going for here? Let the creatives be creative and go, okay, let me help you shape your idea for the objectives you want to achieve. And then once they're all on the same page, then the rest of the creative brief gets filled out with maybe more details of launch dates. Here's the size of the audience, things like that.
I think there are many ways that this can work. There are some foundational ways in which it cannot. And the ways at which it cannot is if we don't give all of the essential information to folks of what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what's important to us from a brand or marketing perspective. And again, I am talking about those story briefs. That's where I think creative operations can have a massive impact on those kinds of engagements inside of organizations and even within when working out externally, right? There are some amazing partnerships between brands and agencies and still internal groups and external groups and where things can be very seamless. There isn't one operating model that sort of rules them all. And we've seen different operating models be very successful, which is another exciting element of creative operations is you've got all these horizontal layers of how to operate here, which makes my job really exciting. But if you don't start with that communication layer, and a tool can certainly help niche, it's really hard to be successful because you're basically hoping that the creative process comes up with what marketing thought they would want and or marketing or sales or whoever is doing the brief. And that's a tough spot to be in. And it can lead to elongated timelines and rebriefs and restarts. And I don't know if you've worked on the brand side, you've been there before and it's not a fun place to be. And you almost always unwind yourself to that moment in the process where you're like, we could have gotten off on a different foot. How? Let's not do that again. Yeah, communication as a creative operations professional is probably the number one tool I would have in my toolkit, ahead of project management, ahead of being amazingly well versed in technology. Those are important too, but being a listener and communicator, being able to lead and push in a little bit without authority and say, actually, your brief's not ready. We're here to participate when the brief is ready to go, but we're not going to be good partners here because the brief is not ready. That's the hallmark of a pretty healthy relationship.
Actually, being a good communicator, a good listener, understanding different perspectives and where everyone is coming from, and then being able to get everybody on the same page so they understand each other and move in the right direction. I think metrics is one of those skills in the stack of creative ops leader skills that really separates the leaders from the pretenders. Are they leveraging data and metrics and things like that effectively? And I agree with you. I think communication is one of those critical skills because I think for those that are still uncertain as to what creative operations is, I think it's very often those that are still rooted in this is a project management problem and solution. And project management is certainly part of what creative operations does. But in my opinion, it's not the job because it's about creating that understanding of two groups that can often be wildly different and they do have different ways of working.
And I think being able to get pretty low inside I use an analogy here of forests and trees. So being able to get pretty low in the forest and kind of see the tree and then just being able to jump back as a creative operations professional and also understand why that marketeer may be needing that thing. So as a creative operations professional, it's pretty important to be able to empathize with the stakeholders across that entire process. And while your title might say creative operations and more naturally align you to participating in the create process, with the story parts of that aspect, if you find that you're struggling to engage on the marketing side or the media side or the earned media side or the social side or the ad tech side or the data side, it's a place to really invest in understanding and empathizing with the journeys that those folks are on, because that's how you're going to get better briefs, which you can then build into better, more sustainable processes and understand what the right technology decisions and the right daily operational decisions are to help the areas that you're operating in scale well. Because no, I don't believe that organizations want the creative operations professional that's just focused on, okay, I've got a campaign, I've got to get it out. I've got a campaign, I've got to get it out. I've got a campaign, I've got to get it out. That's a very functional approach to this profession, and one that I think leads us down a path of not adding the kind of strategic value that our function can and should add in an organization.
100% agree. You're basically talking about, are you a project management function or are you creative operations function? And one idea I've been noodling on lately is I've been thinking about how do we start to provide a bit more definition to creative operations maturity, whether it's as a team or an individual leader. And we've all used phrases like, oh, that person operates at the 100,000 foot level versus at the 1,000 foot level. And I feel like there's maybe something we should be defining and communicating in this community around, am I a 1,000 foot creative operations leader and team, which is more rooted in that project management approach. My job is to basically manage capacity and try and deliver as much as possible on time for as cost effectively as possible. Versus, am I a 50,000 foot creative operations leader and team where, to your point, I do understand what marketing is trying to achieve, what KPIs they are held to, and things like that. The way in which I'm planning and designing how creative operations is aligning people, process, technology is getting in sync with that. And I'm able to communicate to marketing and their goals. And I'm also able to communicate to creative and help them understand what is it that we're trying to do to enable what marketing is being held accountable for. And then am I that 100,000 foot creative operations leader and team where I'm then that much more synced in with the goals of the organization. Oh, we're
Right.
planning on going into this new market in 2025. What should we be thinking about now in terms of process, technology, skill sets that our people are going to need to do that? So it's much more proactive as opposed to reactive.
And I think even within that 1,000 foot view, there's opportunities to stretch to 5,000 or 7,500 feet, right? And find moments to be empathic and curious and open minded about the why. And the great thing about creative and why creative operations, I feel, is such an important strategic place to sit today, is because story is a massive part of the consumer journey. And so the stories we tell will have an impact over our quarterly results in many of the industries that we're in. Or if you're in a smaller industry or a nonprofit or otherwise, the ways that we can influence people's decision to engage with our organization or to buy our product, we can see the results from the work that we do. But there's still a dependence, a reliance on all of those other folks to help set strategy about what we will and won't do and how to distribute that and what we are and not going to focus on. And so we can then help make a stronger, we can help bring that back to the creative process and also help make sure that we're aligning this part of the organization. And those haven't always been aligned because, again, as I started at the beginning of this discussion, is usually creative as prior to maybe 10, 15 years ago when we were defined as a creative operations function, this wasn't an area that was ripe for optimization for, and so that's exciting.
So you just use that word optimization, which to me, in a way, seems like a contrarian adjective when we're talking about creating
Okay.
great stories, right? And you've also talked about in creative operations, it's about managing these different types of workflows, which I think historically has most often been about different content types. We've got our video workflow, our print workflow, our
Yep.
digital workflow, things like that. And we've talked about like scale and story and going back to your definition, you talked about like breathing oxygen into the stories that a brand is telling and the role of creative operations. But we've also got the reality of the marketing organization wants to go to market really quickly. I've been thinking lately about, I think there's two meta workflows that creative operations is responsible for. And workflow one is that scale workflow. We just need to move quickly. Like marketer has idea in the morning for, I want to do this webinar because customers are starting to say X, Y, and Z in user forums and things like that. I know if I'm going to submit this request, there's this creative brief I got to fill out. I got to get in line and I get to go and beg, borrow, and plead.
Yeah,
The
right.
creative ops leader for, can you put me to the top of the line? And the creative ops leader is going, no, get in line. Unless somebody with VP or in the C-suite sends me an email, then maybe you get to the head of the line. So you get that scale and marketers want to move quickly. And that's in any organization. Go to market velocity is a very real thing. And it's either going to be an advantage or it's going to be a disadvantage, not just to marketing, but to the business, because they show up in the funnels. They show up on the top line and bottom line of revenue and profits. And then you've got storytelling, as we've been talking about, which is more that blank sheet where you do need to take the time and things like that. And with creative operations history, as this is about efficiency, this is about speed, this is a project management problem and solution. Is it creative operations' job to own both of these workflows, or should they be separated? Can creative operations manage both scale and storytelling, or do we think about pulling those apart?
It's a really good question. And I've heard you talk about this concept of story and scale. And I do think that while they seem very discrete, they may be more connected than we think. Telling stories today is made very complex by the scale that needs to be created, right? So, what we've done in many of our organizations is we've asked our creative folks, our designers, our creative directors, our copywriters, our creative operations professionals to do both. And so to create time for story and scale. And we've said, develop right against this brief, and then we'll scale that out to market. At the same time, we've had a massive investment in things like automation, scripted automation, then machine learning, and now we're starting to see AI and robotic process automation and some more back office functions that can power scaled metadata enhancement, things that really can power scale. But we haven't necessarily optimized what's coming out of a story work stream, as you describe it, to make it fit for purpose in a scale work stream. So in other words, if you're a brand and you want to tell story, and you want that story to be very bespoke, and let's say you're a luxury brand and you want that storytelling to be very specific and tailored to your product, which people are going to spend very dear amount of money on to acquire. You're not necessarily going to be thinking, is this going to fit into a templated archetype that's going to work with a metadata schema that's going to allow me to scale this into a trans-created marketplace that's going to allow me to get into 85 languages so that I can hit the market day and date with my campaign, right? You're thinking about, how do I make sure that watch or those baubles look perfect on that model? Or how do I make sure that I've got just the right copy and that it's laid out in just the right crop, right? And right now, these things are disaggregated from each other. And I would argue that at some point, we'll bring them together. In other words, we'll have a production strategy for making sure that we can exist beyond just a templated approach to scale. AI will help us break this kind of templated approach to market at some point. We will also say, okay, these jobs can now be done and performed somewhat with the participation of a designer, copywriter, and participating with technology. And that should hopefully free up more time for the storytelling aspect of things. And then I think Creative Ops has a role in that storytelling aspect of things too, which is, how do we take back that time and create the right stories so that we're not just functioning on that scale aspect of things. We've gotten out of whack in certain industries and in certain media channels, I would say. That's the two places I would say that we're a little bit out of whack today as a whole. And I think we can play a part in creating that capacity in that space so that they are two discrete work streams, but scale can participate in the story work stream, and story definitely needs to participate in scale.
Maybe at the higher altitudes, that leader in that team can effectively manage both story and scale because they're very different beasts. And maybe at the lower altitudes, it's more about scale. Totally hear what you're saying about today's approach to automation. And again, we just did this episode with Mark Brady from HubSpot talking about their self-service automation stack and how it's allowed them to accelerate go-to-market velocity and free up creators' time from the sort of the rote work. So they got to have their cake and eat it too, if you will. And HubSpot, I would say, is a pretty sophisticated organization when it comes to like marketing and creative and things like that. Something they did on day one, it's earned over a period of time and a whole bunch of things that worked and some that didn't. And they iterated as they went along, especially with AI, because AI is starting to give us not easy buttons, but being a thinking partner to help with that storytelling.
Sure.
And one thing I'm like curious to get your take on is because you're talking about maybe AI helps us break that templatized approach to automation and scale and allows us to end up creating some sort of interesting connective tissue between stories and scale that goes beyond just personalization, which we've been doing with email for ages.
I think about this a lot. I do think about we've made some incredible advances at the point of distribution to be able to really understand and target the consumer based on what they're doing, on where they are. And that's become expected and to some extent, sometimes embraced by the consumer, depending on what they're doing. And brands have widely used that across certain industries and sectors, right? That's in the market now, right? What's the evolution of that? And how does AI bring that to life so that it's not only the box changes to a different kind of garment based on what's happening in the weather, or that the copy changes based on what you did in the cart? What is enabled when decisioning becomes so quick? And then what do creatives and creative operations people need to enable at the point of distribution from a brand and campaign perspective to allow our brands to still be our brands? Again, a lot of this is future thinking and conjecture, but I don't think there's a limit to what this decisioning should be able to interpret based on consumer behavior, assuming the consumer continues to allow and see the value of a personalized experience with their media. What can't happen for brands is that gets made into kind of this beige future where every brand has access to the same set of tools. And we still need creativity, brand governance, brand storytelling in that process. And so it's not just going to be high velocity. It's like the stock market where it's just going to be the highest velocity trader gets the trade. And I'm in creative operations. Of course, I believe this, but the value of the creative, right? The influence of the creative, the complexity of the storytelling, the approach of the storytelling, the imagery, that should have an impact. Will we get to a point where that can all be driven through computer vision? I don't know, but I think there's a healthy role for how storytelling comes to life even at that point. But we may set it up differently at the end point, and we may have to learn different ways that we're gonna set up those universes. And by the way, media buying professionals didn't used to sit and buy programmatically off an auction market. Now they do. So visual communicators may wind up having a much more close connection to consumers as well. We should just be open that where creative is changed and how it's made dynamic in a scale place might require us to have different tools as we're going through the creative process, convey them differently through decision making technology, but protect brand and protect story.
This whole idea of scale and storytelling meta workflows, right now they feel a little bit separated. They obviously are related. They feel a little bit separated as tools like capabilities from automation and AI continue to mature, I wonder if they'll feed on each other because on one hand, scale is going to allow us to produce more and more content at a faster and faster rate. And this isn't creative operations or marketing. This is just a human thing. It's more and faster describes the baseline human need. So we're going to be doing more and faster. And we've all seen the data, those of us that are paying attention to it. Consumers, including you and I as individual consumers, are increasingly ignoring that content, that advertising and things like that. We've trained our mind to just scroll past it or fast forward through the ads, even if you're on the advertising tier on Amazon Prime or Netflix or things like that. It's just, I'm not going to pay attention to that. And I think in this world of automation and AI, a lot of that content, that story that was like compelling yesterday gets more and more quickly commoditized, which then creates the need for more new stories
Right.
and it feeds on each other. There used to be a time where, hey, if we put out great new creative or story once every, let's call it a year or even 2 years, we can not coast on that, but we can get a lot of ROI on that story for a long time and we can scale that. And it feels like we've increasingly been going towards a time, and I wonder if it's about to go into hyperdrive where we're going to need more new stories as quickly as possible, and we're going to need to more immediately scale them. I wonder if one of the skill sets that creative operations leaders need to think about having is creatives who think with both story and scale in mind, or is that a totally different role that creates that connective tissue between the story meta workflow and the scale meta workflow?
We absolutely do. Does that mean every person that's working in this creative ops supply chain that we talked about has to be an expert in that? No, but I think we have to have people who are thinking deeply about how do we align the roles of the future to the tools at our disposal. And story is one of those tools, especially visual communication and the written word and right. And so there's a reason they call it standout creative is that it stands out. And so we have to find ways to make it stand out. And I think you'll see designers get closer to distribution, not farther away. I think you'll see creative operations professionals get closer. So I have this slide, Nish, the briefing process used to be a very linear one, right? You brief, you perform against the brief, you do all your production and you do all your wrangling and your approvals and produce, and then you send it out and then someone else takes it and puts it into the world. Now it's more of a figure eight, right? It's more of an infinity loop, but it's not fully actualized yet because there's still broken connections back to the storytellers. And so what does that future look like where their designers or copywriters at that point working in smaller pods? I think about this a lot. Like, how does that change? Some of my most profound conversations when I was working on streaming at NBC Universal were just really understanding the need and the context of my performance media colleagues, this pace and speed at which they needed to work in order to take advantage of the programmatic market. How do I turn that into a benefit? I think there's a couple brands that are doing actually really cool things in that space. And why? Are they moving closer do they have some storytellers who are moving into those scale workflows? In other words, you would say, Nish, you might say, I would protect like the most dear resources of an organization, the highest order creatives and creative operations professionals. I would reserve them for the story exercises, but maybe they should be closer to the point of distribution because maybe that's where they can have impact. And I hope your listeners at home aren't like, oh my gosh, the future is so unclear. But I think we need to start by saying there's room to invest in how we tell stories and to make that process less fractured, more oxygen, right? But as we get to rapid data interpretation, personalization, being in front of consumers rapidly with new creative, there's also a role for creative there and really standing out in those marketplaces and not just having it be template driven. I can change the color of this pill, or I can change the CTA, or I can change these attributes. We're going to break that soon. That velocity is coming and it's exciting, but the roles are going to change just as they changed in media. And how do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that builds on the skills that we have and introduces new ones.
It is unclear, but I think that's exciting and 100% agree on getting closer. You called it the point of distribution. I've long been screaming about like, dear creative operations leaders, go and ask for marketing data. How are these campaigns performing? How is this content performing? You're going to be a better partner and
100%.
you're going to better understand. Again, it's moving up from that 10,000-foot level to the 50,000-foot level and rooting yourself in the marketing funnel. Cause ultimately that's what it's about. You created a bunch of content and creative. Awesome. It's great creative, but did it actually have an impact? And that ultimately is what matters. And I love this idea of like almost creating these like little pods of marketers and creatives and other skill sets in that team. And I think with as we leverage it more as a thinking partner,
Mhm.
I think the roles of today are going to evolve into different types of roles. And I think organizations, because of how quickly the world is moving, need to move from less monolithic structures and into more of this pod type of model and get each pod to attack a certain part of the funnel or a certain market opportunity, like a product or a customer segment or a geographic segment or something like that. There's a lot of exciting possibilities there. And the more involved creative is with that, the better, because creatives are curious and big thinkers, right? Like
And
certainly creatives that are really good at like, how do we create these templates that can scale and things like that? But I think a lot of creatives like are just naturally curious and thinkers, and we leave so much value untapped from them. And that's also part of the role of the creative ops leaders you're talking about. Help marketing understand what the creative team can also bring to the table. It's not just about, oh, okay, we created this PDF or a video for you or something like that. Let them help you shape and mold that clay of an idea. There's just so much value left untapped. And I think for the creatives, get them comfortable with understanding that marketing data, because ultimately that's what you're there in the service of. That's what your work is serving.
I think there is still room for specialty and craft. And when you meet a craftsperson, it's an amazing experience, right? To sit in a room with someone who is a world class editor or a world class illustrator or a world class copywriter is it's an inspiring experience. But more and more to be curious about what each person does and to take knowledge together as a team, I think is actually how the world is moving, augmented, as you said. And it's absolutely right. By we're going to have assistants on these teams and they're going to be driven by AI. And then now we're getting into the futurist part of today's episode. We're going to come in and we're going to have these come in virtually to the pod and we're going to say, what can the assistant help us with today? And what do we need to solve as a team? What's the data telling us? And what do we need to solve for? And I think not that all of our work will be so responsive. I still think plenty of it will be strategic and driven, but I do think working cross functionally, bringing specialists and craftspeople in when we need them, but having people who are really literate with data, having creative operations people who actually understand how creative gets made, and having empathy for that process is really important too.
Yeah, maybe part of what creative ops leaders need to do is everybody's got to spend a day or a week on the customer support desk, understand what's frustrating customers and things like that. Maybe we should have take your creative to work day so they can go and see what the marketers are dealing with and the pressure of delivering against building that different parts of the funnel, whether it's top of the funnel or middle of the funnel or bottom of the funnel, and converting it. And similarly for the marketers to go and see what do the creatives go through. Cause I think very often people go, oh yeah, those guys over there, they just fire up Photoshop and they do stuff. And now they've got these AI tools. So they're just going to press buttons. Why can't I get everything I want like tomorrow morning? That's not the way it works. Let's just spend a couple of minutes riffing about AI. Going back to where we started on the creative brief process. I think there's lots of low hanging fruit that creative ops leaders are just leaving on the table that they could be benefiting from today. You're talking about communication in the creative brief process. I'm really enamored with the idea of giving that marketer the ability to use a tool like Midjourney with some training and things like that on how to effectively use it for that brand, and to do a picture says 1,000 words. Let them, as part of that, I'll call it the pre-brief before the ceremony, upload a picture or a video using Runway. So it starts to facilitate that communication with creative of sort of here's like the idea in my head. I'm not a Photoshop person. I'm not like a naturally visually inclined person. I can see things in my head, but I can't draw them and I can't use Photoshop for the life of me. So using that in the creative brief process to facilitate that communication, I was talking to somebody recently and they were telling me they have these internal meetings with the marketers where they talk about what are they trying to do, and maybe they did a recent market research report and they just have a roundtable discussion about it with the creative team. I was like, do you record those episodes? Because you should record them all and then feed them all into something like ChatGPT so that as you're going through that creative brief process, you could use ChatGPT as, I'll use an NBA reference here, like the sixth man in the room type of deal.
Mm.
And it just, again, it allows you to partner with AI in interesting, relatively easy ways now. Because I think a lot of creative ops leaders are getting hung up on, we tried Midjourney, but it's like inconsistent. Yeah, it'll get there eventually where you could use AI to create on brand visual content and things like that for scaling. But for now, I think there's lots of interesting ways in which AI can be leveraged.
I totally agree. And I think if we just look inwardly for a second into our own creative operations work area, right? If we just take the more project management aspects of our job, like how many people spend hours generating work back schedules, right? How do we track our budgets? Many of us have financial systems, but there are many tools that do that. Dashboarding, getting sets of data about our own internal operations, whether you're tracking dates in spreadsheets or you're tracking dates in a project management tool. If you can dump a CSV file onto your desktop, you can use ChatGPT to be a data scientist for you. There are lots of tools that are like 10, $15 a month, and you can ask them in very natural language, like things that I'm no data scientist. And while I was at NBC, I had a whole team that was data scientists. I don't have that today, but I still have a need to understand the data that drives my business. But AI can really help me with that. So I would counsel, let's look first at ourselves and say, what are the things that I do where I go, how can I give myself back 60 minutes a day? What would help? I love to take notes, right? But I'm not always the best note taker. Can I run my notes through ChatGPT or Otter AI or some other form that's going to allow me to have really clear, cogent notes that I can remember, later on? And again, I'm focused on the project management tasks because those are super low hanging fruit, right? And we haven't even started to talk about more complex communication tasks. We talk to a lot of, there's like 8 AI tools that are now plugged into the chat GPT
Right.
universe. But if you even think about the chat tools that are in your business, whether it's Slack or Teams or GChat, there are thousands of AI plugins now that can analyze what you're, maybe hundreds, that maybe like overanalyzing with thousands, that can give you some reporting on what you're hearing and give you some insights into what's happening, right? So how do you use those? And then if you think about that for yourself as a creative ops professional, then think about your creative colleagues. What's the low hanging fruit for them? Are they still, if you're working a motion graphics workflow, are people still rotoscoping stuff? Why? Are we converting imagery? There are certain jobs that are now just made way easier that don't have all of the complexity that some of the more generative AI things have. Because there are real concerns about copyright and other things that, but so much of this efficiency stuff is out there and you just have to have the courage to try. And it's probably won't work for you right away. I remember the first time I prompted Chat GPT, I had no idea what I was doing. As with anything, you have to develop a little bit of courage and a little bit of a habit for doing stuff. And so I think my advice here, Nish, and I don't know, I would love to hear your experience here, is get on and try. Give yourself a target of, I'm going to save myself X amount of time today on this because this stuff's out there.
I think every company and every team, as a creative ops leader, you got to be training your team into a R&D lab. And I think every company should be doing that because if the statement is true that AI is going to change everything, then everybody has to be in the lab at the same time. Otherwise, that's how people will get left behind. I don't buy into the current doom porn around like your job is going to be eliminated. That to me is small ball thinking. It assumes everything we have in the world today is as it should be. And we just need the robots and AI to come in and take over all the work. No, we constantly create a new tomorrow and new possibilities, outsourcing that work that you shouldn't be doing. If you're going from being 1,000-foot creative ops leader to a 10,000-foot creative ops leader, yes, use AI to outsource your work back reports to it. Why are you spending your precious time doing that and then complaining you don't have enough time to deal with everything? Start to put together a list of all the things that feel like machine work. I should have a robot to do this. Cool. You probably can go and find a robot to do it, and you could do a experiment with it and a pilot and see if it works or not. And then if you're going from 10,000 feet to 25,000 feet, start to take your reports from all the tools that you're using, your PM system, your resource management system. Maybe you've got a skills database and things like that. And then, as you said, in natural language, just feed it into a tool like ChatGPT and start to ask it questions you never even thought about. You could even start with, here's the following reports for the last 3 months or 6 months, and like a bullet point on what each report is, and say, my job is the creative operations leader. I'm often held accountable for delivering content, delivering more of it, doing it on time, doing it cost effectively, and content that has an impact. So even go and grab the marketing data and then even ask ChatGPT if you're not even sure what questions to ask. What questions should I be asking of this data? So you could even start there, right? Because often we're paralyzed by the enormity of that blank screen of what can I ask it? It's like the menu at Cheesecake Factory. There's 5,000 things on this. I'm just going to get like the thing I always get. And then I think that moves you from thunking into becoming a thinking partner as a creative, using AI as a thinking partner for yourself. As a creative ops leader, you should then be looking at your team going, oh, I got one or I got 10 project managers. How can I help them outsource their machine like work to AI, that thinking work? And then how do I free up their time to invest into using AI for thinking work? Going back to communications that we talked a lot about, how do my project managers free up their time so they can spend more time just talking to people on the team, creating that more of that translation and understanding and injecting more of that humanity into the process? And these are things we can start doing today. Everyone is getting tripped up with AI for two reasons, maybe three. One is paralyzed by the enormity of AI is going to change everything. And we don't like change naturally. And this feels like it's going to be a lot of change. Two is a lot of people are waiting for perfect. And then they use an AI tool once and it's not perfect. And it's just like, nah, this is garbage. I'm not going to use it. No, you got to like work at making it work for you. And three is, I think it's that blank screen of, I almost feel like we need to prompt humans so they know how to prompt AI. Like you and I have just riffed on a couple of examples in the last 10 minutes. And if we're to go into any creative ops team and give them those examples, it gives them that initial spark and they go, oh, cool. Now I'm going to try this, 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 this.
I also think oftentimes, and this is not related directly to AI, but I'll bring it back to AI, is I often used to say to the teams that I led when I was on the brand side, when everyone else is standing still and doesn't know what to do, we should be the folks who are saying, let's try this, let's try this, let's do this. When you reach that point where you're stuck, I believe it should be the creative operations folks who try to start to unpick whatever the problem is. And the same can be said of AI right now, right? Which is there's a lot of talk around it. The tangible value is expected and it's coming. And there are people who are way ahead on the hype train and there are people who are way behind on stop the buses. And the answer is somewhere in the middle, right? It always is. But there's no reason that as it relates to tasks related to creative operations, both the efficiencies that we can build out of AI and basically any type of automation, and the ways in which we can make the lives of the people that we work with more delightful, have more time for storytelling, make the fear of the blank page just a little bit less terrifying, right? That's one of the things AI is really good for. We'll be better for it. And it's in our interest as creative operations professionals to jump in, even if the water's a little chilly still, to start swimming to the first buoy. And you're not going to make it all the way across the lake yet. Just get to that buoy and there'll be something of value there for you, right? There'll be a place to rest. and something that you'll feel accomplished about. And then you'll get to the next one. We don't know exactly. And back to our conversation about what does the end point look like here with distribution? I don't know. And Nish, I venture to say you don't know either. But I know us standing still is not the way we're going to help lead that transformation inside of these organizations, and the way that we're going to continue to make creative and creative operations essential to the way that consumers make decisions, and continue to build on what I think has just been an incredible last 10 or 12 years of defining the impact of what we can do.
That to me is like a fun place to start. I don't know. Even if you're the leader, like starting with the I don't know gives everyone the freedom to go, cool. So anything can go on that blank whiteboard. Yes, let's start with that. And I think that's one of the advantages of AI is if it is going to change everything, then let's just start with I don't know how the future is going to unfold. We never have, but especially now because of the enormous scale and the speed at which that change feels like it's going to come at us. So last question, like we end every episode, is who would you like to hear from on a future episode of the Creative Ops podcast?
I guess I would love to hear from either some marketing leaders or some creative leaders about the impacts of great creative operations professionals and their organizations, and how we can further build and burnish our sort of credibility as we seek to mature the definition of what it is that we do. And we're into our maybe second or third generation of worker. And so I would love to hear from that marketing leader or that creative leader about what they feel makes a successful creative operations partner. I know you've had amazing guests on in terms of practitioners from our field, and I saw you have a list of really cool folks upcoming. But I think maybe attaining an outside perspective on what we're good at and maybe what we're not so good at as a group, so that we can continue to see our blind spots and understand where we need partnership or where we need to invest in technology solutions, right?
100% agree with you. I'll add marketing operations to that list, along with like marketing executives and creative leaders. We're going to start in on with a episode where I'm doing it with Amy Tesh Strickland, who's been both on the marketing ops and creative ops side. And we're going to be talking about where should creative operations sit in an organization. And I think there's probably the answer today, and not to keep beating the AI drum, but we talked a bit about how roles are going to start to blend as you can partner with AI as a thinking partner and maybe move beyond your specialization and into other areas.
And I just want to thank you so much for having me on today. I look forward to doing this again. It's this time has flown by, but it's wonderful to be able to sit and unpack these big things that I think about all day long and all day long at ICP. Thank you so much, Nish. I really appreciate you having me on.
Hey, thanks. Look forward to doing the next one and doing some more crystal ball gazing about the future.
Let's do it.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Remember, please do 3 things. Number 1, head over to creativeops.fm and sign up for that companion newsletter. Number 2, whatever your favorite podcast player is, please hit subscribe. Search for Creative Ops, all one word, Creative Ops Podcast. Make sure you don't miss the next episode. And remember, number 3, this isn't just my journey of curiosity. This is our journey of curiosity about all things creative ops. So if you've got a question or maybe a different perspective about what you heard today, or maybe you just want to share something that you're curious about, drop me a line at nish@creativeops.fm. Thanks so much, and I look forward to catching you at Creative Ops Water Cooler for next week's episode.